Imagine you wake up before sunrise. You wash your hands. Not once, not twice, but 7 times. You say a prayer, and then you walk to work. Your job today is to reach inside a human body through a small incision and pull out every organ by hand. Not because you're a criminal, not because you're a monster, because you are one of the most skilled and most feared plum professionals in all of ancient Egypt. You are an embalmer, and what you do every single day is the reason we can still look into the faces of people who lived 3,000 years ago. Stay with me, because what these people did to a human body is both deeply disturbing and absolutely extraordinary. Let's start with a question most people never think to ask. Who actually did this job? In ancient Egypt, embalming wasn't a trade you stumbled into. It was a sacred profession passed down through families, embedded in religious law and governed by some of the strictest rules in Egyptian society. At the top of the hierarchy sat a figure known as the overseer of mysteries, the Hairy Seshta. During the actual embalming ritual, this man wore a mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. He wasn't playing a role. He was believed to literally channel the god's presence into the room. Every cut, every prayer, every movement he directed was considered a divine act. Below him worked the Setem priests, assistants responsible for chanting the correct spells, burning incense, and making sure the spiritual dimension of the process never slipped. Because to the Egyptians, if the ritual wasn't performed perfectly, the soul of the deceased could be lost forever. That was a genuine fear, not a metaphor. And then there was a figure that genuinely surprised me when I first came across him in the historical records, the slit maker. His entire job was to make the first incision into the body. One cut, that was it. And the moment he finished, the other embalmers would chase him out of the room, throwing stones at him as he ran. Not as punishment, not out of anger, but because cutting open a human body, even a dead one, was considered a transgression. A necessary one, yes. But someone still had to carry the symbolic weight of that violation. And that someone was the slit maker. Think about that for a moment. These people built an entire social ritual around the guilt of touching the dead. That's not superstition, that's moral sophistication. Now let's get into the actual process. I'll warn you, some of this is graphic, but I think once you understand the reasoning behind each step, you'll see it differently. The full embalming process took exactly 70 days. Not 69, not 71, 70, because that was the number of days the star Sirius disappeared below the horizon each year before rising again. The Egyptians saw it as the ultimate symbol of death and rebirth. The mummification timeline mirrored the journey of the star. Day 1 through 4, the brain. Here's something that still catches people off guard. The ancient Egyptians did not consider the brain to be important at all. To them, the heart was the organ of intelligence, emotion, and the soul. The brain was essentially filler, something that needed to be cleared out to make room for the preservation process. So how did they remove it? Through the nose. An embalmer would take a long bronze hook, insert it through the nostril, push it up, into the nasal cavity, break through the thin bone at the top called the ethmoid, and then stir. The brain tissue would liquefy and drain out through the nose. Whatever remained was scooped out with a narrow spatula. It sounds brutal. But when you consider that they were doing this 3,000 years before modern surgery, using instruments they designed themselves based on pure observation, it's remarkable. Day 5 through 10, the organs. This was the slit maker's moment. A precise, small incision on the left side of the abdomen. Then, with careful hands, the embalmers would remove the stomach, intestines, liver, and lungs. One by one, each organ was washed in palm wine, treated with natron salt, and placed into its own dedicated container, a canopic jar. There were 4 jars, each protected by one of the sons of Horus, a different deity for each organ. The baboon-headed Hapi guarded the lungs. The human-headed Imseti protected the liver. The jackal Dua Mutef watched over the stomach, and the falcon Kebesenuef kept the intestines safe. This wasn't decoration. These jars were considered the organ's eternal home. The heart, however, was always left inside the body, because in Egyptian belief, the heart would face judgment in the afterlife, weighed on a scale against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and justice. If your heart was heavy with sin, it would outweigh the feather, and a monster called Emmet, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, would devour it instantly, erasing your soul from existence forever. If your heart was light, you would live for eternity. The Egyptians didn't believe in heaven for everyone. You had to earn it, and your heart was the evidence. Day 11 through 40, the drying. With the organs removed and the brain gone, the body was now packed, inside and out, with natron. Natron is a naturally occurring salt found in dry Egyptian lake beds, and it's extraordinarily effective at pulling moisture from organic tissue. The body would be completely covered, stuffed internally with linen soaked in the salt, and left alone for 40 days. During those 40 days, the embalmers didn't simply wait. They continued their prayers, replaced wet natron with fresh dry natron, and monitored the process. By the end, the body had lost the vast majority of its moisture. What remained was darkened, shrunken, but structurally intact: skin, hair, nails, facial features. Preserved. From day 41 to 70, the embalmers focused entirely on the wrapping. And this is where I think people underestimate how much artistry was involved. High-quality linen was sourced specifically for this purpose, sometimes donated by the family, sometimes purchased from temple stores. The wrapping wasn't done randomly. It followed a precise anatomical sequence, with amulets placed between each layer at specific locations on the body. A scarab amulet over the heart, a jed pillar amulet near the spine, protective figures placed at the hands, the feet, the throat. The entire time, a priest read aloud from what we now call the Book of the Dead, a personalized collection of spells, prayers, and navigational instructions designed specifically for that individual's journey through the afterlife. Some of these texts ran hundreds of pages. Wealthy families paid enormous sums to have the finest scribes write them by hand on papyrus and include them in the tomb, which brings us to the question of money and status. Archaeologists have found actual pricing contracts on papyrus from ancient Egypt that lay out exactly what different levels of mummification cost. A full royal-quality mummification was extraordinarily expensive, the equivalent of many years of wages for an average worker. A basic mummification, which involved far less ritual and cheaper materials, was still out of reach for the poorest Egyptians. Most ordinary people were wrapped in simple linen and buried in the desert sand, where, ironically, the dry heat preserved them almost as well as the elaborate process did. Some of the best preserved bodies from ancient Egypt are people who couldn't afford a single embalmer. The embalmers themselves lived in a separate district of the city, not as outcasts, but because their work demanded ritual purity. They couldn't simply walk from an embalming table into a marketplace. They had their own temples, their own festivals, their own closed community, and they were compensated well for it. They occupied one of the strangest positions in Egyptian society, simultaneously sacred and untouchable, respected and feared, essential and avoided. 3,000 years ago, in a city along the Nile, a man woke up before sunrise every morning, washed his hands 7 times, and went to work preparing the dead for eternity. He knew the name of every organ he touched. He knew the spell that protected each one. He knew that a single mistake, a wrong cut, a missed prayer, a poorly placed amulet, could mean the destruction of a human soul. That's not a job, that's a calling. And because of him and thousands like him, we can walk into a museum today, stand in front of a mummy, and look at the face of someone who was alive in 1200 BC, who had a name, who had a family, who someone loved enough to spend a fortune on so they could live forever. That is what mummification actually was. Not a curiosity, not a horror story. It was the most serious promise one human being could make to another. I will make sure you are not forgotten. If you want to keep exploring the ancient world through AI reconstruction, subscribe, because next time, we're going inside the Valley of the Kings on the day a royal tomb was sealed for the last time.